Okay, here we are. Well, first of all, welcome back. It is so wonderful to be back with Drive Home Reviews meets Abbott and Costello. We've taken a little bit of a hiatus, a little bit of a break for the summer. A lot of stuff was happening, and I just kind of wanted to breathe. I also wanted to put this one off a little bit to get it out closer to October, the Halloween season, kind of as a dual mashup between, Drive Home Reviews meets Abbott and Costello and the This Is Halloween reviews, because this is another one of my go-to Halloween films. I love watching this movie, and this is one of my all-time favorite movies, but I love watching it at Halloween. But I also wanted to put a little bit of distance between the basic reviews and this one, because this one looms large. This is an important movie. This isn't just another one in the kind of conveyor belt of films that stars would make at the time. This one has become a cultural touchstone. I don't think I'm exaggerating by saying that. This is the film that did so much and influenced so many people. Just a short list. The director and writer of last year's This Is Halloween Reviews film, The Monster Squad, cites Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein as one of his primary motivations. You want a bigger one? Okay, I'm not a particular fan of his movies or him as a person, but I know a lot of people are big fans of Quentin Tarantino, and he lists this movie among some of his most profound influences. Of all the films Abbott and Costello did, this is the only one to land on the American Film Institute's list of the 100 funniest movies of all time. Okay? And for Abbott and Costello, this is the pinnacle. This is the high point of their film career. Anybody who knows anything about Bud and Lou's film career, they usually associate them with one of two things. First, it's usually the service pictures. Those were very big and very important. So those service pictures jump to mind, and just how many different branches of the service they were in. But eclipsing that, dwarfing that, people know the Abbott and Costello meet fill in the blank. It became synonymous with them and their careers. Hell, the name of this show is Drive Home Reviews meets Abbott and Costello. And it's this film that gets the credit for that. Not only that, but this film also had kind of the secondary reaction of putting a bow on the Universal monster movie franchise, if you can believe that. Yes, I'll make this reference again, I'm sure, but this film is essentially the Universal monster films Avengers Endgame. This is their send-off. And what's so amazing about it is that to them, making it really was just another conveyor belt film. It was just the next one in the series, the next thing they were going to do. They weren't out to make a comedy standard. They weren't out to make, one of the most influential comedy films of all time. They were just trying to make their next film and get it done and get it out, and then move on to the next one. But by that same token, Casablanca was very much the same way. It was just another studio film. It was hacked and slashed, and they were rewriting it on the fly, and yet, when all was said and done, it turned out to be greater than the sum of its parts. And so, too, is the case with Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. This film is magnificent. As I've mentioned, it's one of my all-time favorite movies, and talking about it, reviewing it, is just an intimidating task. So much so that I'm not even sure how to go about reviewing it. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let's back up a little bit. And before we get into this film and the remarkable existence of this movie, we need a little bit of a history lesson. We got to go back in time a little bit. So I've mentioned multiple times during these reviews that the Abbott and Costello pictures, starting with their war pictures and then the many, many, many films that came after, were some of the most successful films of the war and post-war era. That Universal was just raking in the cash with these movies. However, at this same time, the Bud and Lou film series was almost running on a parallel with another film series from the same studio. And this, of course, being the now legendary Universal Monsters franchise, which began in 1935 with the original Dracula starring the iconic Bela Lugosi, and then following that up later that year with the original Frankenstein starring Boris Karloff as the creature, and continuing on with its sequel in 1935, The Bride of Frankenstein, equally iconic. And then capping off the big three, the Iron Man, Thor, Captain America of the Universal Monster films, The Wolfman, starring the great and underrated Lon Chaney Jr. And these films were incredibly popular and were big box office for the studio. And shortly, somewhere in its run, the studio decided, hey, we're making great money with these Frankenstein movies. The Wolfman made a lot of money. What happens if we combine them? If we do Frankenstein meets the Wolfman? And in fact, they did. And it was a huge hit. Ironically, in that film, Bela Lugosi played the Frankenstein monster, which is equally ironic because he originally turned down the role because he felt he was too handsome and didn't want the makeup covering up his features. Anyway, so once that film hit, now the studio was making a lot of monster team-ups. There was The House of Dracula, The Curse of Frankenstein, Dracula's Daughter. There were just a lot of these films where all of these monsters were coming together, played by varying actors. There was kind of a continuous plot, more or less, going through them. These films were the blueprint for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, believe it or not. So much so that, if you remember, a few years ago, Universal actually tried to restart their dark universe with that Tom Cruise piece of shit Mummy movie, trying to recapture this cinematic universe vibe that they started and that Marvel was now printing all the money with. However, as we reach this point in time, 1948, both of these sets of films, the Abbott and Costello movies and the Universal horror films, were both kind of at a similar point in their development. The Universal monster films had started out very artistic. Watch the original Dracula. It's a little goofy, I will say, but it has atmosphere out the ass. It is just gothic and beautiful. And Bela Lugosi, rightfully, is the go-to Dracula. He is why we know Dracula's name and we have these in Good Evening. It's because of him. The two Frankenstein films directed by James Whale are masterpieces, and they're gorgeous. They're not just horror films, they're almost like living paintings. And the same can be true a little bit to a lesser extent with the original Wolfman. There's a lot of cool, it was a groundbreaking film for makeup. But by the time they get to this point, the films had degenerated a little bit because the studio just wanted to pump them out faster. They wanted to make the money, and so they became chintzier and cheesier. The original actors had all kind of departed or refused to come back, with the only exception being Lon Chaney Jr., who served as kind of the Tony Stark or the Nick Fury of this universe, being the only actor to play one role throughout the entirety of these films. Interesting side note, I just love dropping these. This is going to be a lot of tidbits. Did you know Lon Chaney Jr. is, in fact, the only actor, not only to play one character throughout all of these films. So the Wolfman was never played by anybody else but him. But he's also the only actor to also have played the Wolfman, Frankenstein, and Dracula. Yeah, so he played all three of the Holy Trinity, or the Unholy Trinity, perhaps. However, getting off track. So the films had started to become a little bit more, I won't say campy, but they had started to kind of lose their edge. Meanwhile, as we've documented on this show, Abbott and Costello started out huge. They were massively successful. And by the time this film came along, they were still successful. Their films were still pulling in big box office, but their bit had been done. They had produced a shit ton of movies by this point in time. So people had seen them. And they were desperately in need of something to revitalize them, something to give their bit, which was still funny and still working, but to give it a much-needed jolt in the arm. And then these two roads met in a yellow wood. And boom. Now, that's underselling a bit. This idea didn't just pop forward fully formed. Actually, the origin of this film came from several years earlier. Abbott and Costello actually wanted to do a Broadway show. They were itching to get back to doing Broadway and to doing live theater. They missed the audience interaction and the one-on-one with the audience. And so they had thought, well, if we do something with the Universal monsters, but the makeup and everything, the budget was too much. It would have cost too much to run. So the idea was ultimately scrapped. So in 1948, when they were looking for, okay, what's next for Bud and Lou? What's the next film? They just decided to take some of the bits that they had already been working on for this Broadway show and say, well, let's just do that. Universal owned the rights to both, and everyone said, great, let's go. And that's kind of how this film came into being eventually. So, if you've never seen it, let me just give you the briefest of rundowns of the plot. So the plot for this is that, long story short, Dracula wants to put Lou Costello's brain into the body of the Frankenstein monster to make the creature more subservient. He wants to put a simple brain into the monster so it will obey him. So the film is basically the monsters chasing after Lou believing that they exist, and Bud, of course, not. It's the candle bit from Hold That Ghost, which they actually do again here, with Lou seeing the supernatural thing and Bud not, and of course Bud not believing him. Into this, of course, comes Lon Chaney Jr. as the Wolfman, who is attempting to stop and destroy Frankenstein and Dracula. And so the whole thing becomes this, wacky chase and whatnot. I don't know how to review this movie. I really don't know how to review this movie. I believe, one of my core beliefs as an artist, as a filmmaker, as a director, as a playwright, as an actor, is that there is no such thing as a perfect movie. There's no such thing as a perfect performance. Everything has a flaw. Nothing is ever perfection. But I'm going to tell you, this film comes pretty damn close. I really believe also that sometimes the stars just align and things just come into being when they need to come into being and in the exact way they need to. And this film is as close to comic perfection that I think you can find. Everything about it works. The jokes are crisp. Abbott and Costello are at the top of their game. It is not hyperbole, and it is not overstating the matter to say that this is the most energetic you've seen them in a long time. The work is fresh, the concept is good, and just all of their bits are working. The story makes sense. It's not waylaid by musical numbers or boy-girl stories or any of the other things that you would normally associate with an Abbott and Costello movie. all of it just freaking works. So trying to review this movie is very, very difficult. The most I can try to think of to do is to talk about why. How did this come together so well? And I think to answer that question, we have to look at two major factors. I think there are 2 points as to why this movie just clicked and all the pieces came into being right in the way they needed to. The first thing we have to understand is that horror and comedy are not as different as we may think they are. When we hear those, we tend to think they are on two very different ends of the spectrum. Horror's over here, comedy's over here. I mean, one's designed to make you, laugh, and the other's designed to scare the shit out of you. So it doesn't seem like those two things should go together. But they actually do a lot more than they don't. And especially back then, the Universal horror movies, even the really artistic ones, had a flair for some slapstick and some comedy beats in there, mainly designed to try to defuse a little bit of the tension that the audience was feeling. Particularly, The Bride of Frankenstein and The Invisible Man, both directed by James Whale, had an actor named Ula O'Connor in them, who was just this mugging, overacting old woman who would get scared by the mantra. It's really, really out of place, to be completely honest with you. But James Whale apparently loved this woman and put her in everything he could, so he found her hysterical. So the point is that comedy was not out of place in these movies. It was actually part of their original DNA. You can even see that now, especially after Scream came out. And it seems like after Scream, a lot of horror films are now cringingly self-aware. And they feel like they have to hang a lampshade on here's the black guy who's going to get killed. Oh, here's the slut that's going to show her boobs and get killed. They all feel like they have to comment on it. But there it is. There's the comedy aspect. Also, when you consider that, they proved all the way back with Hold That Ghost that one of the funniest things in the world is Lou Costello when he's scared. So much so that they tried working things in to other films to get that reaction. That whole haunted house bit in Keep 'Em Flying is, there for that exact reason, to get him that scared reaction. So these things were not alien to one another, and in fact the pieces fit together a lot better than anybody really could ever have hoped. But here's the other major thing, and this one's been commented on quite a lot as people have analyzed this film over the years. But I think the reason this film is so successful is something I touched on way, way back when we were talking about the service pictures and why the service pictures held up so well, is because of the magic word. Aretha Franklin can sing it for us. RESPECT, respect. When you look at the... Sorry, my brain kind of froze up there for a second. When you look at the service pictures, one of the things I mentioned about them is that even though they were comedies and even though they were poking fun a little bit at Army life or Navy life, the institutions never came off in a bad way. The Army, the Navy, the Air Corps, they were always portrayed with absolute 100% respect. Maybe they had one jerk officer that, was always kind of in Bud and Lou's face, but like in the original Buck Private, Sergeant Collins was not seen necessarily as a bully. He was an authority figure. He was an authority figure who was trying to get control over these two idiots. It wasn't until Buck Privates Come Home he kind of became a bully that we wanted to see get his comeuppance. But Bud and Lou always treated the services that they were parodying with absolute respect. And that is what makes this film work. This is not a parody. of a horror movie. This is a horror movie with Abbott and Costello in it. And any parts of it that are parodied are done so with the absolute love and respect. No less an authority than Mel Brooks once said that you can't make fun of something unless you love it. And in this film, the monsters, Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, they are not the butt of any jokes. They are just as horrifying and just as scary as they ever were in their own films. The funny part is Lou Costello reacting to it. They never, ever treat the monsters as ridiculous or foolish. As I've said, this film is kind of the Avengers Endgame. This is the last hurrah for the classic stable of horror monsters. The Holy Trinity of Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman. The Universal horror films would still continue and would get kind of a second breath in 1954 with The Creature from the Black Lagoon, but the team-up movies, the original three, this was it. This was their last hurrah. And they went out respectfully. They went out as a thank you. And that's why this film works. Okay. It is interesting that the belief that the monsters were going to be made fun of and belief that they were going to poke fun at the world is one of the reasons why the original Frankenstein's monster, Boris Karloff, did not return. They offered him the role, and he turned it down flat for a couple reasons. One, he was old. He had retired from the role. And two, he felt like they were going to make fun of the monsters, and he really had deep affection for the Frankenstein's creature. He didn't like it when people called it the Frankenstein monster. He preferred to think of him as the creature. So he did not want the creature to be made fun of. Now, when he saw the film and saw that they, in fact, did not make fun of it, he had a change of heart. In fact, would go on to do 2 movies with Abbott and Costello, which we are going to talk about. Now, to that point, I have to say, I'm of 2 minds with this little historical point. On the one hand, it would have been wonderful as, again, the final hurrah of the big 3 Universal monsters. It would have been great to have the original Frankenstein's creature back in the roster. Because then you would have had the first Dracula, the only Wolfman, and then the first creature. That would have been fantastic. Just from a horror movie and historical buff kind of thing, I think that would have been amazing, just to say that. Especially when you can also say about this film, this is an interesting tidbit. As I mentioned, Bela Lugosi is what we think about when we think of Dracula. When you think of the costume, you think of the mannerisms, the dialogue, the accent, everything. It's Bela Lugosi. He is the Christopher Reeves of Dracula. He's either the one everyone is compared to or everyone is trying to get away from. But did you know that he only played Dracula twice? In the original and in this movie. Those are the only 2 times he ever played Dracula. He may have played Dracula-like characters, but, he only played Dracula twice. So, sorry, another historical tidbit. So anyway, back to Boris Karloff. So it would have been great to see him in this movie. But at the same time, I feel like the role Frankenstein plays in this film as something to be scared of, as a hulking, thunderous brute, that was not the Frankenstein's creature that Boris Karloff created. The Frankenstein for this film was his predecessor. Or was it is this his predecessor? No, it's his... whatever. The guy that came after him. Sorry. Words went out of my head. Glenn Strange, who played him after Boris Karloff retired from the role. And I think that's the better choice, because Boris Karloff's creature was much more thoughtful. It was a much more emotional. If he had been this, it would have been more like, it would have been a better story if Lou made friends with the monster. as opposed to kind of being scared by it. But if you want it to be scared, you need Glenn Strange. So there you go. So I think it actually works out better for the story, in my opinion. So yeah. Another thing I really want to talk about is just in terms of how this movie looks. This movie looks different than every other Abbott and Costello film before or since. It's shot different. It's presented different. The director, Charles Barton, is a longtime Abbott and Costello collaborator. He did a lot of their films, and he was one of their best, one of the ones that they liked working with the most. He knew how to control them, basically, and keep them happy. And it's amazing just how much this film, in the lighting, the gothic tone. I love the set for Dracula's castle, because apparently there's a huge castle on an island somewhere in Florida. Anyway, the set for this castle is immense. That the actors on it just look tiny in comparison. And I love that, whether they meant it to or not. It is this feeling of Bud and Lou, especially when they're in there, of these two guys in this much bigger world than anything they've ever been in before. And it's a world that's so big, it's imposing and scary by how vast it is. And I love the visual language of it. It's a gorgeous looking movie. Yeah, look, I could go on and on. I really could. Nothing I could say would benefit you as much as going and watching this film. If you have not watched this movie, you need to do yourself a favor and watch this fucking film. It is a masterpiece. It really is. And it's worth all the hype. Everything about it works. And it did everything it set out to do, whether it meant to or not. It put a nice bow on the Universal monster films, and it revitalized Abbott and Costello's careers. This is kind of the turning point. I'm not going to say that we're in the latter half of their career just yet. We're getting there, but this is kind of that very clear breaking point between the second half of their career and going into their later career. This is their big hurrah. They're never going to reach heights like this again. But it put them back on the map and proved that they were a commodable brand just on their own. How many movies after this were just called Abbott and Costello Meet, or Abbott and Costello Go To, or Abbott and Costello In, that you could bank just on their names? It's a wonderful film. It is one of my all-time favorite movies, and I love it more with each passing view, and I laugh at it every single time. So if you've never had the opportunity, if you've never had the pleasure, I urge you, this Halloween, get yourself a big bucket of popcorn, turn down the lights, light some candles, put on Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, and just laugh yourself silly. The last point I want to make about this before we wrap up is an interesting side note. It's a funny movie, but they did their job sometimes a little too well. Both my parents remember saying that when they were kids, and this film was a regular on late shows, that this film actually scared them. And I remember thinking, how could this scare you? It's a comedy. You got to remember, I came to Abbott and Costello as a teenager, not as a little kid. And the way my parents explained it to me is that because, one, it felt like a regular horror film. The way it's shot, the way it looked, the gothic shadows and all that. The story was very reminiscent of the classic horror films. So that's number one. And number two, they said that because Lou Costello was so childlike, that when the monsters were chasing him, it was exactly what it would feel like for a monster to be chasing a little kid. And also that relationship that Lou had to children of, being afraid of something and trying to tell the adult in your life, in this case, Bud Abbott, I'm scared of this thing is coming, and to just be told, you're being stupid, shut up. That kids really connected with that in a way they hadn't really connected with an Abbott and Costello film before. So as a result, this film actually scared kids, which I don't think is what they originally intended, but it did. And of course, those kids grew to love the film over time. But I just think that just shows how well they did their job. So yeah, there it is. That's the best I can do talking about this film. Better critics can do better, but I love this film. Go watch it. You won't be sorry. We're going to see just how big of an impact this film had on Abbott and Costello's career very, very shortly. But as we've already seen with this series, because the films were being pumped out so fast, this wasn't a case where one film happens, you have 2-3 years to gauge the impact, and then garner the next one to what worked. You kind of have to learn as you go. Because while this film was being wrapped up and getting ready to go and be going into distribution, they were already working on the next film, which had nothing to do with anything horror related. So the next time we meet, we're going to do a complete shift into a little bit more traditional Abbott and Costello fare, but still one that's very enduring and has special memories for me personally, which we'll talk about. So join us next time when we join Abbott and Costello on a Mexican hayride. So thank you very much for joining me. Please go check out this movie, and as always, drive safe, and I will see you at the movies.